The envelope arrived on a Wednesday morning, not delivered by the regular mailman, but by a private courier who made me sign 3 separate forms before handing it over. The paper inside was thick, official, and smelled like expensive lawyer offices and impending doom. When I saw the words "Family Court" and "Petition for Conservatorship" typed in bold black letters across the top, my coffee mug slipped from my hand and shattered on my kitchen floor. The sound of breaking ceramic somehow felt appropriate for what was about to happen to my life. Before we dive in, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now, because this story is going to take you on a journey you won't forget. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and let me know if you've ever been the invisible child in your own family. Trust me, by the end of this, you'll understand why that question matters. My name is David Chen, and I'm 35 years old. Up until that Wednesday, I thought I understood what family meant. I thought I knew the difference between love and possession, between concern and control. I was catastrophically wrong about all of it. The document in my hands was a legal petition filed by my own parents, Robert and Patricia Chen, asking a judge to declare me mentally incompetent to manage my own affairs. They wanted complete control over my finances, my property, my decisions, my entire adult life. The stated reason made my blood run cold as I read it aloud in my empty apartment. A pattern of reckless financial behavior, emotional instability, and poor judgment that places the respondent at substantial risk of exploitation and self-harm stood there in my kitchen, broken coffee mug at my feet, reading and rereading those words. Reckless financial behavior, emotional instability, poor judgment. These were the clinical legal terms they'd chosen to describe me. Their son, the man who had built a quiet, stable, completely independent life over the past decade, the man they apparently believed was so incompetent that he needed court-appointed guardians who would conveniently be them. I looked around my apartment, this space I'd worked so hard for, the books on the shelves I'd built myself, the vintage record player I'd restored over 6 months of patient weekends, the view of the city I'd earned through years of grinding work and careful saving. This wasn't the home of someone unstable. This was proof of exactly the opposite. But apparently my parents saw something different when they looked at my life. Or maybe they just saw an opportunity. Let me take you back to understand how we got here. My parents, Robert and Patricia Chen, were what everyone in our community called a power couple. My father was a senior investment banker at Morrison & Associates, one of those firms where people spoke in hushed tones about 7-figure bonuses and partnerships that set you up for life. My mother was a commercial real estate developer with her own firm, the kind of woman who wore designer suits to breakfast and closed $1 million deals before lunch. They lived in a sprawling house in Westchester Heights, the kind of neighborhood where the mailboxes cost more than most people's cars. From the outside, they were the American dream incarnate. Successful, wealthy, respected, powerful. Inside that beautiful house, the air was different. It was thin and cold and transactional. Growing up as the son of Robert and Patricia Chen meant understanding from a very early age that love was not unconditional. It was a reward system. Affection was currency, doled out based on performance, on meeting expectations, on becoming the reflection they wanted to see. My older brother Marcus was a natural at their game. He absorbed their values like a sponge, mirrored their ambitions perfectly, went to Wharton, joined a prestigious consulting firm, married a woman whose family had old money connections. He played the part of successful heir so well that our parents practically glowed when they talked about him. I was the malfunction in their perfect machine. I didn't want to be an investment banker or a corporate lawyer or a real estate mogul. I wanted to be a sound engineer. I wanted to work with music, to spend my days in recording studios, helping artists bring their visions to life. I wanted to build soundscapes, not investment portfolios. To them, this wasn't just a different path. It was a fundamental betrayal of everything they'd built. The breaking point happened when I was 25. I'd just completed my degree in audio engineering and production at Berkeley. It hadn't been easy. I'd taken out student loans, worked part-time at a music venue, lived in a tiny apartment with 2 roommates and a persistent mold problem. But I'd done it. I'd earned my degree in something I actually cared about. My parents threw a dinner to celebrate, or so I thought. The moment we sat down at their massive dining room table, my father slid a folder across the polished wood surface toward me. Inside was an application packet for an MBA program at Columbia. "This is where you're going next, David," he said. His tone left zero room for discussion. "This sound engineering phase has gone on long enough. We've been patient, we've let you explore, but it's time to get serious about your future. You'll start in the fall semester. I've already spoken to the admissions director." I looked at my mother, hoping for some sign of support, some indication that she understood this was my life we were talking about. She was cutting her steak with surgical precision, not meeting my eyes. "Your father's right," she said to her plate. "You're too intelligent to waste your potential on a hobby. That'll never provide real security. You need to think about wealth building, about establishing yourself in a field with actual growth potential." That's when I understood with brutal clarity that they didn't see me. They never had. They saw an asset to be managed, a reflection to be polished, an extension of their own ambitions. That night, after dinner, I went up to my old bedroom, packed a single duffel bag with clothes and a few personal items, and left. I didn't slam the door. I didn't have a dramatic confrontation. I just quietly walked out of that house and didn't look back. The years that followed were the hardest and most important of my life. I worked 3 jobs at one point. I was an assistant sound engineer at a small studio during the day. I tended bar at night, and I did freelance audio editing on weekends. I lived in apartments where the heat barely worked, and the neighbors were so loud I could hear their entire lives through paper-thin walls. I ate ramen more nights than I care to count. I wore the same 3 pairs of jeans for years. But I was free. I was building something that was entirely mine. I paid off my student loans cent by cent. I saved obsessively. I learned the recording industry from the ground up, working with local bands, independent artists, podcast producers, anyone who needed sound work. I got good at it, really good. My reputation grew quietly in certain circles. I became the guy you called when you wanted your album to sound professional but couldn't afford the big studio rates. 5 years ago, I landed a contract position at Meridian Studios, a mid-sized but well-respected recording facility in the city. It wasn't the biggest studio, but serious musicians recorded there. The owner, a guy named Sam Kowalski, who'd been in the industry for 30 years, took me under his wing. He taught me not just the technical craft, but the business side. How to negotiate rates, how to build client relationships, how to turn a passion into a sustainable career. 2 years ago, Sam offered me a partnership stake in the studio. It wasn't a huge percentage, just 12%, but it was real equity. I took out a small business loan to buy in, and suddenly I wasn't just an employee. I was an owner. My income stabilized and then grew. I started being able to breathe. Financially, for the first time in my adult life. That's when I bought my apartment. Nothing extravagant. Just a 1-bedroom in a converted warehouse building in an up-and-coming neighborhood. But it was mine. I saved for 3 years for the down payment. I bought it outright with a mortgage I could actually afford. And I spent months making it my own. I refinished the floors myself. I built custom shelving for my extensive vinyl collection. I soundproofed one wall so I could have a small mixing setup at home. Every nail I hammered, every wall I painted, felt like a declaration of independence. My relationship with my parents during those years was minimal and strained. We spoke maybe 4 times a year, stiff phone calls on birthdays and holidays where they asked vague questions about my life, and I gave vague answers. They never visited my apartment. They never asked to see my studio. They never once asked about my work in a way that suggested genuine interest. The one time my mother did ask, her words were, "Are you still doing that music thing? Or have you found something more stable?" When I told her I'd become a partner in the studio, there was a long pause. "Oh," she'd said, "well, I suppose that's something." They existed in their world of country club memberships. and charity galas and investment portfolios. And I existed in mine of late night, recording sessions and local music scenes, and the satisfaction of helping an artist hear their vision come to life. We were orbiting different suns. I thought the distance was peaceful. I thought we'd reached an unspoken agreement to simply live separate lives. I should have known better. People like my parents don't accept detente. They accept victory or they escalate. So when that conservatorship petition arrived that Wednesday morning, it wasn't a complete shock. It was the nuclear option I'd always feared they might deploy, but never truly believed they would actually use. A conservatorship. They were asking a court to legally declare that I, a 35-year-old man with a steady career, a business partnership, a paid-off car, and a home I was actively paying a mortgage on, was incompetent to manage my own life. They wanted control of everything. My bank accounts, my business stake, my property, my decisions. The legal document laid out their case in cold, clinical language, a pattern of financial immaturity, demonstrated by the respondents' choice to pursue a low-income career path despite possessing the education and family connections to achieve significantly higher earning potential, social isolation and rejection of familial guidance indicating possible attachment disorders or oppositional defiance, reckless expenditure on non-appreciating assets such as musical equipment and collectibles, refusal to accept professional financial management or planning despite multiple offers of assistance from qualified family members. Reading it felt like looking at my life through a funhouse mirror. Every choice I'd made twisted into evidence of incompetence. My career wasn't a choice. It was immaturity. My independence wasn't strength. It was isolation. My purchases weren't investments in my passion. They were reckless spending. And the kicker, the part that made my hands shake with rage as I read it, they claimed this was all out of concern, out of love, out of a parental obligation to protect their vulnerable son before he made decisions that would lead to his inevitable financial ruin and personal crisis. My hands shook as I stared at the petition. The lawyer who filed it was Daniel Morrison, my father's colleague from Morrison and Associates. Of course it was. They'd kept it in the family, used my father's professional connections to build their case. For a moment, standing there in my kitchen, with coffee soaking into my socks and this document in my hands, I felt like that 25-year-old kid again. Small, inadequate, wrong in ways I couldn't quite articulate. Then I looked up and around my apartment, at the life I'd built brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck, decision by careful decision. At the gold record on my wall from an indie artist whose debut album I'd mixed, an album that had unexpectedly blown up and earned me a small royalty percentage. At the vintage synthesizer I'd restored and that now got rented out to other producers for sessions. At the bookshelf full of technical manuals and music theory texts and novels. I actually enjoyed reading. This was my life. I'd built it with my own hands, my own skills, my own stubborn refusal to become who they wanted me to be. And I would be damned if I let them take it because they didn't understand or respect the architecture of it. The panic hardened into something else. Something cold and clear and diamond-hard resolve. I was not that scared kid anymore. I was a man who'd fought for every good thing in his life. And I was about to show them that the quiet son they'd underestimated had been watching, learning, and preparing for exactly this kind of battle his entire life. I picked up my phone. I didn't call just any lawyer. I called someone I'd heard about through Sam at the studio. A guy named Marcus Green, no relation to my brother, who specialized in what he called family warfare cases. Adult children fighting off predatory guardianships, elder abuse, financial coercion. Sam had mentioned him once when talking about a friend whose family had tried to pull something similar. Marcus Green doesn't just win cases, Sam had said. He scorches the earth and salts the fields. That's what I needed. Not just a defense, but a message that would echo. I left a voicemail explaining my situation. An hour later, my phone rang. Marcus Green's voice was deep and measured, the kind of voice that sounded like it. Had seen every dirty trick in the book and had counters for all of them. Mr. Chen, I've reviewed the basics of your situation. I'm going to be direct with you. This is a serious, aggressive move by your parents. Conservatorship petitions are usually reserved for elderly people with dementia or young adults with severe disabilities. Filing one against a functional adult with no documented mental health issues or addiction problems, that's bold. It's also potentially very revealing about their real motives. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning? We have work to do. His office was in a modest building downtown, nothing flashy. The waiting room had plain furniture and outdated magazines. But when Marcus Green came out to greet me, I understood immediately why Sam had spoken of him with such respect. He was in his 50s, African-American, with close-cropped gray hair and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He wore a simple suit, no expensive watch, no status symbols. He looked like a man who didn't need props to project authority. We sat in his office and he folded his hands on the desk. Tell me everything, not just about this petition. About them, about you, about every interaction, every comment, every time they tried to influence or control you since you were old enough to remember. Leave nothing out. For the next 3 hours I talked. I poured out the history, the conditional love, the constant comparisons to Marcus, my brother, the way they'd use money as leverage, offering to pay for things only to hold it over my head. Later, the dinner where they demanded I abandon my career, the decade of cold, disapproving distance, the snide comments about my choices, the way they'd tried 6 months ago, very casually, to get me to sign some papers my father said were just estate planning documents, but that I'd had the sense to have, reviewed by my own attorney, only to discover they would have given my parents power of attorney over my finances. I'd refused, and my father had been furious in that cold, controlled way of his. Marcus listened, taking sparse notes, his expression giving nothing away. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. Okay, here's what we're dealing with. They framed this as concern for a struggling son. Classic tactic. To beat it, we do 2 things. First, we prove you're not just competent, but exceptionally so. We'll get testimony from your business partner, your clients, your bank, your mortgage company. We'll show a decade of increasing financial stability and professional success. Second, and this is crucial, we prove their motive isn't concern. It's something else. Control, possibly money. Do your parents have financial problems? I blinked, caught off guard. I don't know. They've always lived large. The house, the cars, the lifestyle. But I've been out of their lives for a decade. I have no idea what their actual financial situation looks like. Well, Marcus said, leaning forward, we're going to find out. Because people don't usually file conservatorships against stable adult children out of nowhere. There's usually a trigger, financial pressure, a sudden need for liquidity, something. If they're in trouble and they see your assets as a solution, that's not protection. That's predation. And judges do not look kindly on that. He steepled his fingers. The hearing is in 4 weeks. We'll file our opposition immediately. But David, you need to be prepared for something beyond the legal arguments. You need to be prepared for emotional warfare. In that courtroom, they will not be your parents. They will be adversaries who've hired expensive counsel to paint you as incompetent. They will look at you with practiced concern. They'll speak about you in the third person as if you're not there. Your mother might cry. Your father will use that calm, authoritative voice that makes disagreement seem like hysteria. You cannot react. You sit, you listen, you look exactly like what you are. A competent, calm, successful adult. Your reaction is part of the evidence. Can you do that? I thought about all the times I'd bitten my tongue in that house. All the times I'd absorbed their disappointment without defending myself. All the years of walking away from fights I couldn't win. I'd been training for this my entire life. Yes, I said. I can do that. Good, Marcus said, standing. I'll have my investigator start digging into their finances immediately. You go live your life. Be normal. Work at your studio. Pay your bills on time. Be the person you are. Do not contact your parents. If they reach out, direct them to me. This is war now, David. And the first rule of war is never let the enemy see you coming. I left his office feeling terrified and electrified in equal measure. For the first time since that envelope arrived, I didn't feel alone. I had a general, and he was already planning the counterattack. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into normalcy as a survival strategy. I went to the studio every day, worked on projects, met with clients. Sam, my business partner, was the first person I told outside of Marcus. His reaction was immediate and volcanic. "Are you kidding me? Your parents are trying to what?" His face went red with indignation. "David, you're the most responsible person I know. You show up on time, you manage budgets better than I do. You've never made a single impulsive business decision. This is insane. I need you to know," he said, pointing a finger at me for emphasis. "Whatever you need from me, you've got it. Testimony, character reference, financial records showing your partnership stake and income, all of it. We're going to bury them in evidence of your competence." That support meant everything. Over the following days, as Marcus's team worked in the background, I focused on gathering documentation. Years of bank statements showing steady deposits and responsible spending. Tax returns demonstrating increasing income. Mortgage payment records with not a single late payment in 3 years. Performance reviews from the studio. Emails from clients praising my work. I created a timeline of my adult life, a ledger of independence. Every bill paid on time, every professional milestone, every quiet achievement was a brick in the fortress I was building. Then, 2 weeks before the hearing, Marcus called. His voice had that tight, controlled excitement that I'd learned meant he'd found something significant. "David, we hit gold. My investigator dug into your parents' financial records, public documents, property filings, court records. That house in Westchester Heights? It's been refinanced 4 times in the last 6 years. They took out a second mortgage 2 years ago. There are multiple liens against it, unpaid contractor bills, a lawsuit from a landscaping company. Your father's firm, Morrison and Associates, is in serious trouble. There's a class action lawsuit from investors claiming mismanagement of funds. Your father's name is specifically mentioned in the complaint. The firm's been bleeding partners for 18 months. As for your mother's real estate company, 3 major development deals have fallen through in the last 2 years. She's got creditors circling." He paused to let it sink in. "David, your parents are drowning financially. That house, that lifestyle, it's all leveraged to the breaking point. And you know what you represent to them. A life raft. Your apartment, your business stake, your savings, liquidating those could buy them time." The pieces clicked together with a sickening finality. The conservatorship wasn't about protecting me. It was about accessing my assets legally. Once they had control, they could sell my apartment, force me to liquidate my partnership stake, drain my accounts, all under the guise of better financial management. By the time I could fight it, the damage would be done, and they'd have survived their crisis on the wreckage of my life. "This changes everything," Marcus said, "but we play it smart. We don't reveal we know about their financial situation yet. It's our ace. Let them present their case. Let them commit to the narrative of the concerned parents. Then we drop the bomb and show the judge exactly what this is really about. When their own desperation is exposed, in contrast to their claims of concern, the judge will see this for what it is, a bad faith filing that abuses the court system. You need to be ready, though. When we reveal this, your father will lose it. Men like him, men who've built their identity on control and success, they don't handle public exposure well. It could get ugly. I didn't sleep much the night before the hearing. I stood in my apartment looking at everything I'd built. The mixing board in the corner where I'd worked on hundreds of tracks. The framed poster from a music festival where one of my artists had performed. The simple, sturdy furniture I'd bought piece by piece as I could afford it. This wasn't just a legal proceeding. It was a reckoning. For the kid I'd been, for the man I'd become, and for the parents who'd never actually known either version. I put on a simple charcoal suit, nothing flashy. Paired with a white shirt and a plain navy tie, I looked like what I was, a professional, responsible adult. When I met Marcus in the courthouse lobby, he gave me a once-over and nodded approvingly. "Remember," he said quietly as we walked toward the courtroom, "they are the performance, you are the truth. Truth is quieter, but it's heavier. Let the weight of it speak." The courtroom doors loomed ahead, and I took a breath, steadying myself for what was coming. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with that particular kind of stillness that only exists in spaces where life-changing decisions get made. The air smelled like floor polish and old wood and the nervous sweat of 100 previous cases. The judge's bench was an imposing dark oak monolith. To the left, at the plaintiff's table, they were already seated. My father, Robert Chen, in what I recognized as his most expensive suit, the Tom Ford he wore for major client meetings. He looked every inch the distinguished financial professional, silver hair perfectly styled, posture radiating confidence and concern in equal measure. My mother, Patricia, wore a cream-colored designer suit that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. Her makeup was flawless, her expression perfectly calibrated to suggest worried maternal devotion. Between them sat Daniel Morrison, my father's colleague and their attorney, a man with the kind of smug, settled expression that comes from years of winning. He was reviewing notes, completely confident. They didn't look at me as Marcus and I took our seats at the defendant's table. The physical distance between our tables, maybe 15 feet, felt like a canyon. I placed my hands flat on the cool wood of the table and followed Marcus's advice. I did not look at them. I looked straight ahead at the empty judge's bench, at the seal of the state mounted on the wall behind it, at anywhere but the people who'd raised me and were now trying to legally declare me incompetent. The bailiff, a weathered man in his 60s with the tired eyes of someone who'd seen every variation of human drama, called the court to order. All rise. Judge Bernard Hastings entered, and the room stood as one. Judge Hastings was in his late 50s, with iron-grey hair, sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of face that had forgotten how to be impressed by performance. He settled into his chair with the weight of authority, scanned the courtroom once, and gestured for everyone to sit. The hearing began. Daniel Morrison stood first, and his opening statement was a masterclass in manipulation dressed up as concern. Your Honor, this is one of the most difficult days of my clients' lives. Robert and Patricia Chen are here today, not out of any desire to control their son, but out of desperate, profound concern for his well-being and future. He painted a picture with carefully chosen words, a picture of a brilliant young man who'd somehow lost his way, who'd rejected sound advice and promising opportunities to pursue what Morrison called a passion project with no financial stability. He described my career choice as if it were a child's fantasy, speaking of my work in recording studios the way you might describe someone who refuses to give up on becoming an astronaut at age 40. My clients have watched with growing alarm. Morrison continued, his voice dripping with false reluctance, as David has isolated himself from family, from the support systems that could help him, from any guidance that might provide real security. He lives alone in an apartment he can barely afford, working irregular hours in an industry known for instability, surrounded by equipment and collectibles that represent poor financial planning rather than investment. They fear, and I believe the evidence will show, that David is vulnerable to exploitation, that his judgment is compromised, and that without intervention, he is headed toward inevitable financial collapse and personal crisis. It was a knife disguised as a hug, every word chosen to make my independence sound like dysfunction. My choices sound like symptoms. Then he called my mother to the stand. Watching Patricia Chen walk to the witness box was like watching a Tony Award-winning performance. Her heels clicked softly on the floor. Her expression was perfectly calibrated between sorrow and dignity. She was sworn in, and Morrison began with gentle, leading questions designed to let her build the narrative. Mrs. Chen, can you describe David's behavior over the past decade? My mother's voice was soft, trembling just slightly, in exactly the right places. David has always been sensitive, creative. As a child, he was in his own world, very internal. We tried to encourage him, to help him develop practical skills alongside his artistic interests, but he resisted any structure. She dabbed at the corner of her eye with a tissue she'd had ready. When he left home 10 years ago, we were heartbroken but hoped he needed space to find himself. But as the years passed, we watched him struggle. He cut us out of his life, refused our help, refused even to tell us basic details about his finances or living situation. We'd hear things secondhand about him working multiple jobs, living in terrible conditions. As a mother, his voice caught, the pause timed perfectly. It's been agony watching your child suffer because he's too proud or too confused to accept help. Morrison led her through a carefully curated series of anecdotes, each one designed to paint me as impractical and lost. The time I chose audio engineering school over business school. The time I bought expensive recording equipment instead of, as she put it, investing in appreciating assets. The time I refused my father's offer to set up an interview at a real firm with a real salary and benefits. Every story was a stitch in their tapestry of my incompetence. My mother's performance was flawless. The concerned parent burdened by a troubled child she couldn't save from himself. Then it was Marcus's turn for cross-examination. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate, and walked to a position where he could see both my mother and the judge. "Mrs. Chen, you've testified that you're deeply concerned about your son's financial situation. When was the last time you actually reviewed any of his financial records?" My mother blinked, the first crack in her perfect facade. "Well, we haven't. He won't share them with us. That's part of the problem, the secrecy. So your concern about his finances is based not on actual evidence of debt or mismanagement, but on your disapproval of his career choice and his decision to maintain privacy as an adult. It's based on a pattern," my mother said, her voice tightening slightly. "A pattern of refusing guidance, of choosing instability over security. A pattern that includes," Marcus said, consulting his notes, "graduating summa cum laude from Berklee College of Music, maintaining continuous employment for 10 years, purchasing a home 3 years ago, and becoming an equity partner in an established business. Is that correct?" My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. "Anyone can get a mortgage. That doesn't mean they can truly afford it or manage it responsibly. But he has managed it, Mrs. Chen." Marcus let that hang in the air before continuing. "For 3 years without a single late payment. His mortgage holder has provided documentation confirming this. Does that sound like financial instability to you?" She didn't answer directly, just shifted in her seat. "You mentioned he cut you out of his life. Isn't it true that David maintains regular contact with his business partner, with clients, with friends in his industry? That he has a support system, just not one that includes you? That's not the same as family. Family is who you turn to in crisis. But he hasn't had a crisis, has he, Mrs. Chen? No bankruptcy, no eviction, no intervention needed. The crisis seems to be in your perception, not in his reality." "Objection," Morrison called out. "Argumentative, sustained," Judge Hastings said, but he was watching my mother with sharp interest. Marcus shifted tactics smoothly. "Mrs. Chen, if David were to marry tomorrow, would you still believe he needed a conservator?" The question caught her off guard. That would be different. A wife would provide partnership, stability. So the problem, in your view, is that he's an unmarried man choosing to live independently and manage his own affairs. That's not incompetence, Mrs. Chen. That's just a life you don't approve of." "Objection!" Morrison was on his feet. "Withdrawn," Marcus said mildly, turning away. "No further questions. My father was next." Morrison's questioning of him was more strategic, playing to Robert Chen's identity as a financial expert. My father spoke in the measured, authoritative tones he'd perfected over decades in boardrooms. He talked about risk assessment, about the dangers of unstable income streams, about David's refusal to diversify his assets or seek professional financial management. He made it sound like I was a ticking time bomb of bad decisions, and only their intervention could prevent disaster. He was colder than my mother, more clinical, but the message was the same. David is a child in a man's body, incapable of seeing the dangers ahead, and we, the competent adults, must step in before it's too late. When Marcus stood to cross-examine him, the temperature in the room dropped noticeably. "Mr. Chen, you're a senior partner at Morrison & Associates, correct?" "That's correct." "A firm specializing in investment, management and wealth advisory, yes, so you're intimately familiar with concepts like leverage, debt-to-equity ratios, and asset management, of course. Your home in Westchester Heights is quite impressive. How many times have you refinanced that property in the last 6 years? My father's eyes narrowed, the first sign of real tension. I'd need to check the exact number. Would 4 times be accurate? Morrison shot to his feet. Objection. Relevance. Judge Hastings looked at Marcus. Counselor, where is this going? It goes directly to credibility and motive. Your Honor, the petitioners claim they're disinterested parties acting solely out of concern. Their own financial stability is highly relevant to whether that claim is truthful. I'll allow it, Judge Hastings said, but tread carefully. Mr. Green, my father's jaw was tight. 4 refinances is possible. The market has been volatile, and the liens currently filed against the property by contractors and service providers are those also due to market volatility. The silence in the courtroom was sudden and absolute. My mother had gone very still, her performance momentarily abandoned in shock that this information was public. Morrison looked like he'd been slapped. My father stared at Marcus with barely contained fury, a vein pulsing at his temple. Those are temporary cash flow, issues being resolved through normal business processes, my father said, his voice low and dangerous. Nothing that impacts my ability to provide guidance to my son. Guidance he's demonstrated he doesn't need, Marcus said evenly, since he has no liens. No refinancing, no cash flow issues. Unlike yourself. No further questions. Your Honor, my father remained rigid in the witness box for a moment, and I saw something I'd never seen before. Fear, not of the legal proceeding, but fear of exposure. The carefully constructed image was cracking, and he knew it. The judge made a note on his pad, his expression unreadable, the morning ground forward. Morrison called a family friend, a woman from my parents' country club, who testified to their concern and my absence from family events, as if not attending their social functions was evidence of instability. He called a psychiatrist they'd hired, Dr. Raymond Foster, who offered vague testimony about attachment issues and financial naivety based entirely on interviews with my parents. He'd never met me, never evaluated me, never reviewed any actual records of my life. Marcus destroyed his credibility in cross-examination, getting him to admit that diagnosing someone you've never met based on second-hand accounts from biased sources violated every ethical standard of his profession. Dr. Foster left the stand, looking embarrassed and small. Then it was our turn. Marcus called Sam Kowalski first. My business partner walked to the stand with the confident ease of a man who'd spent 40 years in recording studios and didn't get intimidated by formal settings. He was 62, with long gray hair and a ponytail, wearing a suit that looked like he'd borrowed it from someone slightly larger. But when he spoke, his words carried weight. Mr. Kowalski, Marcus began. How long have you known David Chen? 10 years. He started at Meridian Studios as an assistant engineer. I trained him personally. And what is your assessment of his professional competence? Sam leaned forward, his voice clear and firm. David Chen is one of the most talented, dedicated, and reliable professionals I've ever worked with. He has an exceptional ear, but more than that, he has discipline. He shows up on time. He manages projects from start to finish. He handles difficult clients with grace. 3 years ago, I offered him a partnership stake in the studio. I don't offer that lightly. I offered it because I trust his judgment, his work ethic, and his business sense completely. And his financial management, Marcus prompted, impeccable. He negotiated his partnership buy-in terms intelligently. He's never missed a payment. He manages studio budgets often better than I do. He tracks expenses, maintains equipment, plans for long-term investments. If David Chen is financially incompetent, then I should probably be institutionalized. A small ripple of laughter went through the courtroom. Judge Hastings' expression softened slightly. Morrison tried to shake Sam on cross-examination, suggesting that loyalty to a business partner might cloud his judgment. But Sam was unshakable. My loyalty is to the studio, he said flatly. If David were a liability, I'd have bought him out. He's not. He's an asset. Marcus called my bank manager next, a professional woman named Angela Torres, who brought documented evidence. She testified to my account history. Steady income deposits, consistent savings patterns, excellent credit score, 0 overdrafts in 7 years. She was dry, factual, and devastating to my parents' narrative. He called 3 clients, musicians and podcast producers, who spoke about my professionalism and the quality of my work. One of them, an indie artist named Maya Rodriguez, whose album I'd mixed, was particularly compelling. "David made my album sound like I had a major label budget," she said. "But beyond the technical skill, he got the vision. He understood what I was trying to say with the music. He's an artist who happens to be excellent at business, and that's rare." Each witness added another layer to the portrait of a man who was not only competent but thriving. The contrast between this reality and the phantom helpless figure my parents had tried to conjure couldn't have been starker. Finally, as the afternoon light began to slant through the courtroom's high windows, Marcus said, "Your Honor, the defense calls David Chen." My heart hammered as I stood and walked to the witness stand. This was it, the moment where I either confirmed everything the witnesses had said or gave my parents ammunition. I was sworn in, my hand steady on the Bible, my voice clear. I looked not at my parents, but at Marcus. He led me through my history with straightforward questions: education, career progression, the decision to buy my apartment, my partnership in the studio. I spoke clearly, explaining my work, my budget, my 5-year plan. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I was just telling the truth about a life that was honestly pretty ordinary. Boring, even. Stable job, paid bills, simple pleasures. It was the normalcy that was powerful. Then Marcus asked the question I knew was coming. "David, why do you think your parents filed this petition?" I took a breath, choosing my words carefully. "I think they genuinely believe their way of life is the only valid path to security. They measure success in terms they understand: high-status careers, wealth accumulation, social position. When I chose a different path, they interpreted it not as different, but as wrong. I think they convinced themselves I was struggling because I wasn't living the life they'd planned for me. And I think," I paused, "I think they may have reached a point where they needed my assets more than they were willing to admit, even to themselves," Morrison objected. But Judge Hastings waved him off. "I'll allow the witness to characterize his understanding of the situation." Morrison's cross-examination was aggressive. He tried to paint me as resentful, as someone with a chip on his shoulder about his successful parents. He questioned why I'd distance myself from family if there wasn't something wrong with me. But I didn't take the bait. I answered calmly, without rancor. I distanced myself because the relationship was conditional, and I needed to build a life on my own terms. That's not dysfunction. That's self-preservation. He tried to make my purchases seem frivolous. "You've spent thousands on musical equipment and vinyl records. How is that sound financial planning?" "Those aren't purchases," I said. "They're tools for my profession, and in the case of certain rare vinyl, appreciating assets. I have a collection of original pressings that's increased in value significantly. I can provide documentation if needed." Morrison looked frustrated. He'd expected me to get defensive, to show some crack in composure. But I'd been preparing for this my entire life, learning to stay calm in the face of their disapproval. Finally, he gave up. No further questions. As I stepped down from the stand, I felt lighter. I'd done it. I'd represented myself clearly and calmly. Marcus gave me a subtle nod as I sat back down. Then he stood. "Your Honor, at this time the defense wishes to submit a comprehensive inventory of the respondent's assets and possessions, prepared by a licensed appraiser and auditor, to be entered into the record." Judge Hastings looked intrigued. "Very well." The bailiff approached our table, and Marcus handed him a thick-bound document. The bailiff took it, walked to the center of the courtroom, and opened the folder. "Your Honor, I'll read the inventory into the record," the bailiff said, his voice the same dry, official tone he'd used all day. He began. "Item 1, primary residence, condominium unit 7D at 428 Maple Street. Current market value, $450,000. Mortgage balance, $220,000. Net equity, $230,000. I saw my father shift in his seat. They'd assumed I was barely making my mortgage payments. The idea that I had substantial equity was clearly news. Item 2, 12% partnership stake in Meridian Studios, LLC. Independently appraised value, $380,000. My mother's hand went to her throat. The bailiff continued, methodical and unaware of the earthquake he was triggering. Item 3, collection of vintage vinyl records, original pressings and rare editions. Last professional appraisal, valued at approximately $620,000. The gasp that went through the courtroom wasn't loud. It was a sharp, collective intake of breath. My father's head snapped toward me, his eyes wide with pure shock. Judge Hastings, who'd been leaning back casually, suddenly sat forward, his full attention locked on the bailiff. Morrison's confident expression crumbled into dawning horror. The bailiff, unaware he'd just detonated a bomb, prepared to continue. For a frozen moment, there was no sound at all. $620,000. The number seemed to hang in the air, visible and solid. Then chaos. Your Honor, Morrison practically shouted, leaping to his feet, his chair scraping backwards. This is absurd, a stunt. There's no way that collection is real or worth anything close to that figure. My father was staring at me, and his expression was no longer concerned parent. It was naked, undisguised shock mixed with something that looked disturbingly like betrayal. What collection? He demanded, not asking the judge, asking me directly. The mask of concerned patriarch was gone, stripped away by sheer avarice and disbelief. What vinyl? Where? My mother looked completely bewildered, her carefully maintained performance in ruins. David, what is he talking about? Judge Hastings slammed his gavel, the crack echoing like a gunshot. Order, silence in this courtroom. The sharp sound restored a fragile quiet. The judge's eyes, suddenly laser-focused, moved from the bailiff's folder to Marcus, to me, and finally to my sputtering parents and their attorney. Bailiff, he said, his voice carrying a new edge of intense curiosity. Continue, but slowly. The bailiff, looking distinctly uncomfortable under the sudden scrutiny, cleared his throat. Item 4, vintage musical equipment and instruments, including a fully restored 1970 Moog modular synthesizer, a 1959 Fender Precision bass, and various other pieces. Insured value, $215,000. Another wave of shock. My father's grip on the table edge had turned his knuckles white. That synthesizer was my pride and joy. I'd bought it as a non-functioning hulk from an estate sale 7 years ago for $3,000, and spent years restoring it to pristine working condition. It had been featured in a documentary about classic synths last year, which had tripled its value. They'd had no idea. Item 5, retirement and investment accounts, 401k through studio partnership, individual IRA, and brokerage account. Combined value, $430,000. Item 6, vintage motorcycle, 1972 Triumph Bonneville, fully restored, insured value, $45,000. That was news even to Marcus. I'd been working on it in a rented garage space, a project that had taken me 3 years. It was my Sunday joy, my meditation on wheels. Item 7, savings and checking accounts. Combined balance, $85,000. Item 8, the bailiff said, and I could swear there was the faintest hint of appreciation in his dry tone. Collection of music memorabilia, including signed instruments, original concert posters, and recording session artifacts. Insured value, $190,000. He closed the folder. Total verified net worth of David Chen, $2.55 million. All self-acquired over a 10-year period. All properly documented, insured, and legally owned. The silence that followed was profound. Judge Hastings leaned forward, his elbows on the bench, his eyes moving between the folder. And my parents, with an expression that had gone from curious to deeply skeptical. Mr. Green, he said slowly, would you care to explain? Marcus stood, and if he felt any satisfaction, he kept it completely hidden behind professional composure. Certainly. Your Honor, what you've just heard is a verified inventory of my client's assets, prepared by a licensed court-approved appraiser and auditor. Every item is documented, photographed, insured, and legally owned by David Chen. The vinyl collection alone has been catalogued by one of the country's foremost experts in rare recordings. Several pieces from it have been loaned to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame for exhibition. The vintage equipment is not hobby purchases. These are functional tools that get used professionally, and that have appreciated significantly. My client has an eye for value, patience for restoration, and discipline for long-term investment. This isn't luck. This is meticulous, intelligent asset building. He turned slightly, casting a glance at my stunned parents. This inventory proves several things beyond any doubt. First, that David Chen is not only financially competent, but exceptionally so. Second, that the petitioner's characterization of him as financially immature is not just incorrect. It's a grotesque misrepresentation. And third, he paused, letting the implication crystallize in the silent room. It raises the unavoidable question of motive. Why would two people facing substantial financial pressures of their own seek control over a son who has demonstrably managed his affairs with spectacular success, while they, by contrast, are drowning in debt and liens? Morrison was back on his feet, his face flushed. Your Honor, this is ambush. We had no knowledge of these alleged assets. Their existence, if they're even real. Their provenance, it all should be excluded as late disclosure. The provenance is impeccable, Counselor, Marcus said coolly. And your lack of knowledge is precisely the point. You filed this petition based on assumptions, on willful ignorance. You assumed because your clients chose to be blind to their son's actual life. There was nothing to see. You were catastrophically wrong. Judge Hastings held up a hand. Mr. Morrison. Sit down. Mr. Chen, he looked at me. Still at our table. Is this your signature on the authentication documents for this inventory? He held up a paper the bailiff handed him. I looked at it. It was. Yes, Your Honor, and you affirm under penalty of perjury that this list is accurate and complete to the best of your knowledge. I do, Your Honor. He nodded slowly, then turned his gaze to my parents. The polished couple from earlier was gone. They looked exposed, caught. Mr. and Mrs. Chen. He said, his tone grave, your petition rests on the assertion that your son is incapable of managing substantial assets. This court has just been presented with overwhelming evidence that he has not only managed such assets, but has accumulated them independently, through discipline and intelligence, while you were apparently unaware of their existence. This severely undermines your credibility as petitioners. My father found his voice, the lawyer in him fighting through shock. Your Honor, if these assets are real, it only heightens our concern. That kind of value in the hands of someone with no formal training in wealth management, it's a target for fraud, for manipulation. The fact that he's been secretive about it, hiding it from his own family, that itself indicates poor judgment or self-protection. Mr. Chen, Judge Hastings said dryly, perhaps your son didn't tell you about his assets because he correctly anticipated you'd try to do exactly what you're doing now. Take them. The accusation hung in the air, blunt and devastating. Marcus stood again. Your Honor, may I present additional evidence regarding the petitioner's financial situation? This is when the ground truly shifted. Judge Hastings gestured for him to proceed. Marcus opened another folder. Your Honor, we have documentation here, all from public filings, showing that Robert and Patricia Chen's primary residence has been refinanced 4 times in 6 years, with multiple liens currently filed against it. We have records of failed investment ventures, unpaid creditors, and most significantly, documentation of the class action lawsuit filed against Morrison and associates for alleged mismanagement of client funds. This lawsuit names Robert Chen specifically and seeks damages in excess of $8 million. He handed copies to the bailiff, who distributed them to the judge and to an increasingly pale Morrison. This lawsuit, Marcus continued, was filed 9 months ago. The Chen's financial situation has been deteriorating rapidly. 3 months ago, they attempted to have David sign over power of attorney under the guise of estate planning. He refused. Now suddenly, they're seeking court-ordered control through conservatorship. A conservatorship that would give them access to liquidate $2.5 million in assets. The timing is not coincidental. This is not concern. This is desperation dressed up as parental duty. The accusation wasn't shouted. It was stated calmly, like a mathematical proof. The evidence laid out step by step. The judge looked from the documents to my parents. Their carefully constructed facade was in ruins. My mother had tears streaming down her face, but they weren't the practiced, performative tears from her testimony. These were tears of shame, of exposure, of a plan utterly demolished. My father sat rigid, his face a mottled red, his breathing heavy. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. Judge Hastings studied the documents for what felt like an eternity. When he finally spoke, his words were measured, but carried the weight of absolute authority. What has been presented in this hearing today is among the starkest contrasts I have encountered in my career on the bench. On one hand, we have allegations of incompetence based on disapproval, assumption, and a profound ignorance of the respondent's actual life. On the other, we have documented evidence of not just competence, but of remarkable financial acumen, professional success, and disciplined long-term planning. He looked directly at my parents, Mr. and Mrs. Chen. You came before this court asking me to believe you were motivated by selfless parental concern. The evidence suggests the opposite. Your ignorance of your son's life appears willful. Your own financial distress provides a clear alternative motive. The timing of this petition, immediately following his refusal to grant you power of attorney, is damning. The petition for conservatorship is denied, dismissed with prejudice. The words fell like a hammer. With prejudice meant they couldn't try again on the same grounds. It was over. But Judge Hastings wasn't finished. His expression hardened further. Filing a frivolous or malicious conservatorship petition is a serious abuse of this court's process. It wastes judicial resources and causes profound harm to the respondent. Based on the evidence presented, I'm ordering a formal inquiry into whether this petition was filed in bad faith. The court will examine the timing, the allegations, and the clear financial motivations behind it. You may face sanctions, both financial and potentially professional, if it's determined that officers of the court participated in this abuse. You will be hearing from the court on this matter. My father's face went from red to ashen. Sanctions, professional consequences. His already crumbling career at Morrison and Associates had just been handed a potential death blow. Morrison himself looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Judge Hastings then turned to me, and his expression softened marginally. Mr. Chen, the court apologizes for the ordeal you have been subjected to. You are clearly a man of substantial capability and character. You are free to manage your own affairs with the court's full confidence. This case is closed. He slammed his gavel once. The sound was final, absolute. The hearing was over. I'd won. Not just won, obliterated their case so completely that they were now facing consequences themselves. The immediate aftermath was surreal. The judge left the bench. A few observers who'd been watching filed out quietly. Marcus began packing his briefcase with calm efficiency. I just sat there, my hands still flat on the table, trying to process the immensity of what had just happened. At the other table, my parents were in disarray. Morrison was hissing urgent words at my father, who was staring at the table, as if the wood grain might contain answers to how his life had collapsed so spectacularly. My mother was fumbling in her purse, avoiding all eye contact. Her perfect composure shattered beyond repair. Marcus touched my arm gently. "Let's go, David. Don't look at them. Don't speak to them. Just walk out." I stood on legs that felt disconnected from my body, but held me steady. I followed Marcus toward the door. I tried not to, but as we passed their table, I couldn't help it. I glanced over. My father looked up. Our eyes met. The fury was still there, but mixed with something else now. A hollow, defeated recognition. He saw me, actually saw me, for perhaps the first time. Not as his wayward son, not as his disappointing project, but as a man who had outmaneuvered him completely. A stranger with resources and resolve he'd never imagined. The realization broke something in his eyes. My mother looked at me, mascara-streaked, face crumpled. "David, please," she whispered. I didn't stop. I didn't say a word. I walked out of that courtroom behind Marcus, through the heavy doors into the bright, ordinary hallway where other people were dealing with traffic tickets and custody. Arrangements and life moved. On outside, on the courthouse steps, the afternoon sun was blinding after the dim courtroom. I took a deep breath of free air. Marcus turned to me, and a rare, genuine smile touched his face. You were perfect. Absolutely perfect. They never saw it coming. The collection, I started, my voice hoarse. When you told me to get everything appraised, I didn't think it would be the nuclear option. David, Marcus said, that collection is the result of a decade of discipline and knowledge. Your eye for value, your patience, your ability to restore and preserve. That wasn't luck. That was expertise. It was the perfect rebuttal to every single thing they claimed about you. You didn't just manage money. You built wealth through intelligence and skill they couldn't begin to understand. He squeezed my shoulder. Go home. Rest. The inquiry into their conduct will proceed, but that's my job now. You are free. Truly free. I nodded, words failing. Thank you, Marcus, for everything. You earned this, he said simply. Then he was gone, striding toward his car, a warrior returning from a battlefield. I stood on those courthouse steps for a long time, letting the reality sink in. It was over. The cage they'd tried to build around me out of their fears and their needs and their desperation hadn't just been opened. It had been revealed to have never had walls in the first place. I drove not to my apartment, but to the garage where I kept the Triumph. I needed to see it, touch something real and mine. I unlocked the garage door, rolled it up. There she sat under her cover. My 1972 Triumph Bonneville, British racing green with chrome that could blind you in sunlight. I pulled the cover off and just looked at her. 3 years of weekend work, learning to rebuild an engine, to rewire, to restore. Every bolt turned, every piece cleaned and polished was a meditation, a declaration that I had time, patience, skill. This too was part of me they'd never known, a secret joy. I ran my hand over the leather seat, and for the first time since that petition arrived, I smiled. A real, full, genuine smile. Then I got on the bike, kicked it to life, and the engine's roar in that small garage was beautiful. I rode home through the city, the wind and noise clearing out the last cobwebs of fear. When I got back to my apartment, I stood in the doorway, looking at my space. My life, every book, every record, every piece of furniture was a brick in the foundation I'd built. They'd tried to call it instability. The court had recognized it for what it was, strength. I made myself dinner, just simple pasta and a beer, and ate it at my kitchen table looking out at the city lights. The silence in my apartment wasn't the silence of loneliness. It was the silence of peace, hard-won, earned, unshakable peace. The days following the hearing had a strange liquid quality. The constant low-grade anxiety I'd been living with for weeks was gone, replaced by a quiet so profound it was almost disorienting. I went back to work at Meridian Studios the day after the hearing. Sam took one look at me, handed me a cup of coffee and said, "You good?" "Yeah," I said. "I'm good." "Then get in Studio B. We've got a folk trio tracking vocals, and they need your ear." That was it. No drama, no long debrief. Just back to work, back to normal. It was exactly what I needed. But normal had shifted. Word spread in the music community. You can't keep something like a courtroom. Showdown secret for long, in interconnected scenes. Within a week, 3 different artists I'd worked with reached out. Not asking for details, but offering support. One sent a text that just said, "Heard you had to fight some battles. Proud of you, man." That quiet solidarity meant more than any grand gesture could have. The legal aftermath continued to unfold. Marcus kept me informed. The court's inquiry into my parents moved forward. They were hit with financial sanctions, required to pay the majority of my legal fees plus a fine to the court for abuse of process. It wasn't bankrupting, but combined with their existing troubles, it was another heavy blow. Daniel Morrison faced a disciplinary review from the State Bar Association for his role in filing what was now officially recognized as a bad faith petition. His partnership at Morrison and Associates was quietly dissolved. My father, already damaged by the class action lawsuit, became toxic by association. Within 2 months, he'd taken early retirement, which everyone knew meant he'd been forced out. Justice, in its cold procedural way, had been served. My parents sold their Westchester Heights house. The sale barely covered their debts. They moved to a modest two-bedroom apartment in a suburb 40 minutes away. The country club memberships were dropped. The luxury cars were traded for practical sedans. Their entire carefully constructed life of status and appearance evaporated. I heard all this through distant channels. I felt no triumph in their downfall, just a sober acknowledgement that actions have consequences. They'd built their lives on leverage and image, and when both crumbled, there was nothing solid underneath. Then, about 6 weeks after the hearing, my phone rang. The caller ID said Marcus Chen, my brother. I stared at the screen for 3 rings before answering. Marcus had been the golden child, the one who'd played their game perfectly, who'd built his life as a mirror of their values. We hadn't spoken since before the hearing. David, his voice was uncertain in a way I'd never heard. Can we meet? Just you and me. Coffee? I hesitated, then agreed. We met at a neutral cafe downtown, nothing fancy. He was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table looking profoundly uncomfortable. Marcus had always been polished, confident, in control. The man across from me looked exhausted and confused. He stood when I approached, then seemed uncertain whether to shake my hand or what. We both sat awkwardly. Thanks for coming, he said, stirring his coffee without drinking it. I didn't know if you would. I waited. I owed him nothing, and we both knew it. He took a breath. I need you to understand. I had no idea they were planning that conservatorship thing. They didn't tell me until after they'd filed. When Mom called and explained, I thought surely there had to be something wrong, some reason. Then the hearing happened and everything came out, and He shook his head. David, I had no idea. About your life, about what you'd built, about any of it. None of us did. That was intentional, I said quietly. If I'd told them, what do you think would have happened? He opened his mouth, then closed it, the answer obvious on his face. They would have tried to manage it, direct it, control it exactly. It wasn't about hiding. It was about it being mine, something I built by myself for myself. He nodded slowly, absorbing that. I went to see them last week, at the new apartment. It's bad, David. Dad barely leaves his bedroom. Mom keeps trying to maintain appearances, but there's no one to perform for anymore. They're broke, they're isolated, and I think they're finally realizing what they lost. And they sent you to what? Asked me to bail them out? No, he said quickly. They don't know I'm here. I came because I've been doing my own reckoning. They're my parents too, and I'm realizing I don't actually know them. I just knew how to please them, the real them, who they are when the image cracks. I'm seeing it for the first time, and it's ugly and sad. He looked up, meeting my eyes directly, and I realized I don't really know you either. My brother, I know this image of you as the family disappointment, but that was their narrative. The truth is, you're the only one of us who actually built something real. He gestured vaguely. I've got a corner office and an impressive title, but I'm realizing it's all scaffolding. You've got foundation. I didn't know what to say to that. We sat in silence for a moment. I'm not asking for anything, Marcus said. I'm not asking you to forgive them or to have a relationship with me or anything. I just wanted you to know that I see it now. What they did, what they tried to do, it was wrong. And you showing up in that courtroom with that inventory, proving you didn't need them or their guidance. That was the most powerful thing I've ever seen. Thank you for meeting with me, he said, standing. I'll let you go. Marcus, I said, stopping him. He looked back. I'm not ready for family dinners or reconciliation or any of that. But if you want to actually get to know each other as people, not as roles in their story, I'm not opposed to that. The relief on his face was genuine. I'd like that. We traded numbers, made vague plans to maybe grab a beer sometime. It was tentative, fragile, but it was something. A possibility of a relationship built on honesty instead of performance. As I walked back to my car, I realized that was its own kind of freedom. I didn't have to carry their narrative anymore. Not the one about their disappointment in me, and not the one about my resentment of them. I could just be David Chen, sound engineer, collector, man who built a good, quiet life. The rest could fall away. The months that followed were the most creatively productive of my life. With the legal nightmare behind me, I threw myself back into work with renewed energy. The studio was busy. We recorded a breakout indie album that got serious critical attention. I was credited as co-producer, and that opened doors. Bigger artists started inquiring about studio time. Revenue increased. My 12% partnership stake became even more valuable. But the real change was internal. I'd proven something to myself in that courtroom. Not that I was competent, I'd always known that. But that I could fight when I had to. That I could stand my ground against the people who'd shaped me and not crumble. That knowledge changed how I moved through the world. I took on more responsibility at the studio. Sam started talking about eventually retiring and me potentially buying him out. I started mentoring a young assistant engineer, passing on what Sam had taught me. I expanded my vinyl collection, but more selectively now, focusing on truly rare pieces. I sold a few strategic items, reinvested in the studio, diversified my retirement accounts. The wealth continued to grow, not as the focus, but as the byproduct of doing work I loved and doing it well. I joined a vintage motorcycle club, found a community of people who appreciated restoration work, made friends who knew nothing about my family drama and didn't need to, rode up the coast on weekend trips, just miles of highway and wind and freedom. I started dating casually, nothing serious, but it was nice to remember I could let someone into my life without fear. That trust was a muscle I'd atrophied, and I was slowly rebuilding it. Marcus and I did meet for that beer and then another. Slowly, carefully, we built something resembling a sibling relationship. He opened up about his own struggles, his growing realization that he'd built his life on foundations he didn't actually believe in. He started therapy. He began making different choices. We'd never be best friends, too much history, too many different paths, but we became something like allies. A year after the hearing, Marcus Green called with news. The inquiry concluded. Your parents have been formally sanctioned. The Bar Association censured Morrison for his role. It's all official record now. You're not just vindicated, David. The system acknowledged they wronged you. There's power in that. There was. Not because I needed external validation, but because it meant the next person who faced something similar might have precedent to point to. That summer, I got an unexpected email. It was from a music preservation society asking if I'd be willing to loan part of my vinyl collection for a traveling exhibit on the history of recorded music. They'd heard about it through industry channels and through, they admitted, the publicity from my court case. I said yes. Seeing pieces of my collection in climate-controlled museum cases with little placards, explaining their historical significance, was surreal and deeply satisfying. This thing I'd built in private was now public, educational, part of a larger story. The exhibit program listed me as David Chen, collector and audio engineer. That summer I also did something I'd been avoiding. I drove past my parents' new apartment. I didn't stop, didn't go in. I just wanted to see it. The building was plain, generic, the kind of place where young professionals and downsizing retirees lived. Seeing it was like closing a chapter. They'd become ordinary, and maybe that was what they'd feared. Most ordinariness, the loss of the exceptional image they'd maintained. I felt a distant sadness for them, like you might feel reading about strangers in the newspaper who'd lost something. But I felt no obligation to fix it. They'd made their choices, lived their values, and faced the consequences. That wasn't my responsibility to repair. 2 years after the hearing, on a random Tuesday, I was at the studio late mixing a track when my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. After staring at it for a moment, I realized it was my mother's new number. The text said, I saw the article about the music exhibit. I'm proud of you. I know I have no right to say that. I just wanted you to know. I stared at that text for a long time. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let it disappear unanswered into the void. Another part, a part that had grown in the peace of the last 2 years, felt something else. Not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of release. I wrote back, thank you. I hope you're doing okay. It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't reconciliation. It was just acknowledgement. 2 people who used to be family, now just 2 people. She responded, we're managing. Your father asks about you sometimes. I don't know what to tell him. You don't need to tell him anything, I wrote. Take care of yourself, Mom. That was it. The exchange felt like the final period on a very long sentence. We were done. not with anger or drama, but with simple completion. That spring, Sam made it official. He wanted to retire, spend time with his grandkids, maybe finally learn to fish. He offered to sell me his majority stake in Meridian Studios. It was a big number, a serious investment, but I'd been preparing for this. I'd saved, I'd planned, and I had the capital. I bought Sam out over a payment plan we negotiated ourselves, over whiskey and stories. About 40 years in the music business. At 37, I became the majority owner of Meridian Studios. The business I'd poured a decade of my life into was now primarily mine. The responsibility was enormous. The freedom was indescribable. We threw Sam a retirement party at the studio. Musicians he'd worked with over decades showed up. There was live music, stories, laughter. Marcus came, meeting my work family for the first time. Seeing my worlds connect felt right. During the party, Sam pulled me aside. "You know what I'm proudest of?" he said, slightly drunk and sentimental. "Not any record we made. It's this." He gestured at me. I took a chance on a hungry kid with talent, and I got to watch him become a man who knows exactly who he is. That's the best legacy a mentor can have. I couldn't speak for a moment. "Thank you, Sam, for everything." He waved it off. "You did the work. I just held the door open. That's all any of us can do for each other." Hold doors open. Life settled into a new rhythm. I ran the studio, balanced creative work with business management. We hired a business manager to handle the financial details. I was good at, but didn't love. I reinvested in equipment, updated Studio A with cutting-edge gear while maintaining Studio B's analog warmth. The studio's reputation grew. We attracted better projects, which attracted better engineers, which created a cycle of quality. The wealth continued to grow, almost as a side effect. My accountant, a woman I trusted who had no connection to my family, helped me establish trusts and plan for long-term security. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was doing exactly the kind of financial planning my parents had claimed I was incapable of. But I was doing it my way, on my timeline, with advisors I'd chosen. 3 years after the hearing, I bought a small house. Not a mansion, just a 3-bedroom craftsman with a garage. I could turn into a proper motorcycle workshop and a basement. I soundproofed for a home studio. I designed it myself, hired contractors I'd vetted, oversaw the renovation. Every choice was mine. The day I moved in, I stood in the empty living room and felt something I'd never felt before. Complete ownership, not just of property but of my entire life. That evening, I sat on my new back porch, beer in hand, looking at my small yard. My phone rang. It was Marcus, my brother. "Hey," he said, "heard you closed on the house. Congratulations, thanks. It's good, solid." Listen, he hesitated. "I know this is probably weird, but Julia and I, my wife, we'd like to have you over for dinner sometime. Just dinner, no agenda. Get to know each other as actual people." I thought about it. The old me would have said no automatically, protecting boundaries. But I'd learned something. Boundaries were important, but they didn't have to be walls. They could be doors you opened selectively. "Sure," I said. "I'd like that." We made plans. It was tentative but real that night. Alone in my new house, I thought about the journey. From the terrified kid hiding in closets to avoid disappointing parents, to the young man who'd walked away with nothing but determination, to the man who'd fought in court for his right to exist on his own terms, to this, a man at peace. The courtroom hadn't been the end of the story. It had been a turning point, a moment where I proved to myself what I was capable of. But the real victory was what came after. The years of building, creating, connecting. The slow, patient work of becoming fully myself. I thought about the bailiff reading that inventory, the shock on my parents' faces as they realized they'd never known me at all. That moment had been powerful, satisfying even. But it wasn't the point. The point was this: a quiet evening in a house I'd bought, in a life I'd built, doing work I loved, surrounded by relationships I'd chosen. The point was freedom. Not freedom from my parents, though that was part of it. Freedom to be exactly who I was, without apology or explanation. If you're listening to this and you've had your own version of that courtroom, maybe it wasn't a judge and a bailiff, but a family gathering, a relationship, a job where people tried to tell you who you were supposed to be, know this: your worth isn't determined by the people who underestimate you. Your value isn't in their eyes. It's in the life you build when you stop seeking their approval and start seeking your own truth. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from people who claim to have your best interests at heart, but who really only see you as an extension of their needs. Sometimes the most powerful rebellion is not dramatic confrontation, but quiet, persistent building of a life they can't touch. The inventory that shocked that courtroom wasn't just a list of assets. It was a ledger of choices made when no one was watching, of discipline exercised when it would have been easier to give up, of faith in myself when everyone I was supposed to trust told me I was wrong. Every record collected, every piece of equipment restored, every mortgage payment made on time was a brick in a fortress they couldn't breach. When the bailiff read that list, he wasn't just reading numbers. He was reading a decade of defiance disguised as daily life. Here's what I learned. The people who truly care about you will respect your choices, even when they don't understand them. The people who only want to control you will dress up their control as concern. Learn to tell the difference. And when you've built something real, something solid, don't be ashamed to protect it fiercely. You're not obligated to set yourself on fire to keep people warm, even if those people are family. Especially if those people are family. The greatest gift I gave myself wasn't the financial success. It was permission to disappoint people whose approval I'd been chasing my whole life. Once I gave myself that permission, everything else became possible. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to fight to be seen as who you actually are instead of who others needed you to be, you're not alone. The world is full of us. The quiet builders, the persistent creators, the people who walked away from expectations and built something truer. Your story matters. 5 years after the hearing, I got one more piece of news. My father passed away. Heart attack. Quick, they said. Marcus called to tell me. There was a small funeral, family only. Marcus asked if I wanted to come. I thought about it for a long time. In the end, I went. Not for my father, but for the kid I used to be. To acknowledge that chapter was finally completely closed. The funeral was small. My mother looked old, truly old for the first time. She saw me, her eyes widened, but she didn't approach. We existed in the same space, but in different worlds. After the service, she came up to me briefly. "Thank you for coming," she said. Her voice was paper-thin. "He regretted it, you know." "What happened?" "He never said it, but I could tell." I nodded. "I'm sorry for your loss." It was formal, distant, but it was respectful. That's all I had to give. I left the funeral and drove to the studio. It was a Saturday, quiet. I went into Studio B, sat at the mixing board, and just breathed in the familiar smell of old wood and electronics and creativity. This was my cathedral. This was where I'd found salvation. I mixed a track for a young artist, a kid who reminded me of myself a decade ago. Hungry, talented, uncertain. When I finished the mix and played it back for him, his face lit up. "This is exactly what I heard in my head," he said. "You got it." That was the legacy. Not money, not collections, not even the studio itself. It was this: helping people bring their visions to life, seeing their faces when they heard themselves clearly for the first time. That was what my parents had never understood. Success wasn't just in the accumulation. It was in the meaning you made. The inventory that shocked the courtroom was impressive. But the real wealth was the years I'd spent building a life of purpose, of craft, of connection. That couldn't be liquidated or controlled or taken. It was mine in a way nothing else ever could be. Now at 40, I run a successful studio. I mentor young engineers. I collect selectively. I ride my motorcycle on Sundays. I have a brother I'm slowly rebuilding a relationship with. I have friends who value me for who I am. I have work that fulfills me. I have peace. The courtroom was 5 years ago, but the battle was won in the decade before it and the years after it. It was won in every choice to stay true to myself when it would have been easier to fold. Every boundary maintained, every opportunity for reconciliation I passed on because it would have meant compromising my peace. The people who tried to declare me incompetent are now ghosts in my story. They didn't win. They didn't even understand what the game actually was. I wasn't fighting to prove them wrong. I was fighting to live free, and I won. So here's the lesson. Build your life brick by brick, even when no one's watching. Especially when no one's watching. Protect your peace fiercely. Seek approval from the person in the mirror, not the people whose love has conditions. And when they finally see what you've built and are shocked by it, don't gloat. Just keep building. That's the real victory. Not the moment of vindication, but the years of steady, purposeful living that make vindication inevitable. The inventory isn't the story. The life you build to create that inventory, that's the story. If you found strength in this, share it with someone who might need the reminder that they're capable of more than the people who doubt them will ever understand. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Your story of building despite doubt, of walking away from toxicity, of proving yourself not to them but to yourself. I want to hear it. And remember, the most important list you'll ever have is the one you write for yourself. The list of who you are, what you've built, and what you're capable of. Write it, own it, defend it. No one else gets to define your worth. Not your parents, not a courtroom, just you. And that's the only authority that matters.